My name's David, aka Bluminek. I'm an archer, a trick shooter, and a performer. And here are my top 5 fantasy archery tropes that are both completely ridiculous and genuinely work in real life. Stories of archers often don't match up with reality, and with good reason. The first archers probably started shooting bows somewhere in Africa around 70,000 years ago, which means people probably first started telling stories about archery sometime around 69,999 years, 364 days, 23 hours and 30 minutes ago, which is a heck of a lot of stories. So it's hardly surprising that in that time we've seen the rise of all sorts of weird and wonderful fantasy tropes and tricks that defy belief, imagination and the laws of physics. But 70,000 years is a long time, and throughout that time, for every storyteller trying to invent new and fantastic things that their archers could do, there have been archers trying to do new and fantastic things for people to tell stories about. And in some cases, the reality really does keep up with the fantasy. Would an archer be good against zombies? There's definitely potential. Bows are faster than crossbows. They're quieter than guns. And not only can the arrows be reused, they can also be repurposed. But while I would love to see more characters felling zombies with shots like this, an apocalypse archer is only as good as their ability to create space and get to vantage points, recover equipment, and of course, get the hell out of dodge. But if they had that kind of training, they'd make excellent scouts, able to evade larger groups when needed and take down individuals, as well as going on supply runs to gather resources and equipment that could be brought back to expand and improve the local community. Zombies Run is an immersive storytelling app where you run in the real world to progress the story. It's being chased by zombies! Seems like good motivation to you. Download the ZRX app for free on iPhone or Android. So first off at number 5, here's the slightly silly idea of a bow with a blade on it. For a good chunk of human history, bows have dominated warfare and hunting with their uncanny ability to stab things that are still a really long way off. But they tend to get a little bit weaker when the thing you want to stab is right up close. And historically, archers have generally dealt with this by carrying an additional pointy stick of their own for just such an occasion. But switching weapons takes valuable seconds, and it kind of defeats the point of my cool signature weapon thing I've got going on. Plus, if I want to shoot someone who's all the way over there now, I've got to ditch this and switch back again. So it's hardly surprising that designers of films, video games, and homebrew tabletop items have all hit on the idea of attaching your melee weapon to your bow. And at first glance, this seems like a great idea. An archer can continue shooting as normal, and then when an enemy gets in close, they just give them a good hard stab, and then get back to business. But at second glance, some cracks start to appear. A bow is designed to transfer energy from your muscles through the bow into an arrow. But every time I make a shot, I also have to expend some of that energy in moving the limbs of the bow, as they go from here to there. And the heavier the limbs are, the more of my energy is wasted in moving the bow, and the less of it goes into the arrow. So if I chuck a dirty great weight on the end, such as a knife or an axe or something like that, then a bunch of my energy is not transferred into my target. The other problem is that bows are constantly under tension. And the more powerful the bow, the more tension it's under. So if someone comes at me with a melee weapon and I have to block, my bow is more likely to break from that impact than a dedicated melee weapon or shield. But if you think this sort of thing is too cool to be allowed not to work, or that the benefits might outweigh the costs, then you're not the first. Because that was a similar decision-making process made by the samurai that employed the hazuyari or yumi-yari into battle. It was essentially a blade, not unlike this one, attached to the end of a long yumi bow. And the length and leverage of it meant that they were effective spears, as well as reasonably powerful bows. Did it have all the downsides discussed earlier? Probably. Was it worth it? Maybe. I suspect there's a reason that this wasn't employed particularly often, even where it was used, and hasn't really been used anywhere else. But the fact remains that it has had a use in history, and attaching a blade to the end of your bow is a potentially viable tactic under the right circumstances. Plus, it's just really cool. At number 4, we have acrobatic archery. In fiction, for a whole variety of reasons, archers tend to play the fast, agile, and graceful characters, opposite steady and straightforward melee weapon users. In games with character stats, it's frequently dexterity or agility that determines the effectiveness of a bow. And in more visual media, that's represented by archers' movesets being supplemented with rolls, jumps, flips, and surfboarding. This is a far cry from modern target archery, in which you could stand perfectly still in a field and only shoot 3 arrows in 2 minutes. And in medieval Europe, the sheer power and strength required to pull a warbow past the ear meant that running about while doing it simply wasn't practical. But that's not the only way to shoot. And a big chunk of the historical cultures that did archery did so from the back of horses or even chariots. And in those cultures, the techniques required to hold the arrows are designed to keep them steady while being jostled about. They allow for aiming while moving and teach you to use points of inertia to make your shot more stable. And while horse archery isn't exactly the same as the kind of agile shots you see in fiction, all of these techniques can be adapted to work for jumping shots, rolling shots, hanging shots, and much, much more. And while most of these are for style points, it's not hard to imagine a circumstance in which diving for that last piece of ammunition before making a shot, or making a parting shot against a pursuing opponent, might just save your life. So while it wasn't standard military practice, for a character who's showy or has had lots of time to train, combining archery with acrobatics is surprisingly plausible. Just maybe not at the same time as a bladed bow. Third up on the list of archery tropes that make no sense is musical bows, apparently. Archers and bards have a long shared history, stretching back from Apollo being the god of both musicians and archers, to my patented pole dancing archery techniques. But somewhere in the middle of that has come the idea that you could take a musical instrument and a bow and somehow combine them to have something that does the job of both. This one immediately seems kind of suspect, and that's probably why you mostly only find it in high fantasy settings, RPGs, video games, things like that. But the logic's kind of sound. Both a musical instrument and a bow consist of a wooden frame and a cable with some tension running through it. Unfortunately, for a lot of instruments, that's where the similarities end. These things tend to be hollow with a chamber that resonates the sound, multiple stringed, and of course, the frames of them are not designed to bend. Meanwhile, these things are specifically designed to bend. The strings tend to be tensioned in a way that makes them as quiet as they can get away with, and they usually don't have a dirty great hollow in the middle of them. And even though something like a harp might look like a bow in terms of shape, in structure, it's closer to something like this. And despite the expression, putting extra strings on your bow gets problematic when you draw one back and the rest start to tangle. So turning a bow into a harp probably isn't an option, at least not without the use of magic. But there is an instrument out there that uses a single-stringed bow as its base. This is a berimbau, a Brazilian instrument with African origins that's used in the martial art of capoeira. It consists of a single stick bent with tension through it and a single string, which might be a design fairly familiar to you. It then has the addition of this big resonating chamber and is played with the use of a string and a rattly pot. I only got this morning, so my playing is something like this. I.e. like a child whacking at sticks. But the most interesting aspect of it for me is that these were originally developed from African hunting bows. And every single part of it that's not the bow can be relatively easily removed. This particular one was designed as a musical instrument exclusively, with no archery in mind at all. The stick is therefore not as flexible as I would like, and I'm kind of concerned about breaking it, but even so, it can launch an arrow a decent distance. And if you wanted to, you could play it using an arrow rather than the original stick. So it's fairly easy to imagine that if you replaced this with an actual bow, you'd have something that could be an instrument in times of peace and a weapon in times of war. There are several forms of instrument that are similar to this, and almost all of them originally stem from using just a regular bow. And even if all you do is slide the resonating chamber onto a regular bow and then slap it about with an arrow, you've got a moderately good percussion instrument. And then when you want to shoot someone, ditch that bit and get straight into the shot. So for the archer bard who absolutely must have a weapon and an instrument on them at all times, the bidding bow might just be the weapon of choice. Kind of appropriately for number 2, this next trope is shooting 2 arrows at the same time. A fairly common design choice when making modern video game archers is to take a bunch of gun tropes and apply them to bows. And if that's the case, the multi-shot is essentially the shotgun. But it's not just limited to video games. This shot crops up in films, TV and literature as well. And it's understandable, because one of the obvious and perceived weaknesses of a bow is that it's relatively slow to make more than one shot. So if you've got multiple enemies coming in close quarters, you might as well just shoot both of them at the same time. Not only does it visibly make the archer more effective when outnumbered, but it also demonstrates how cool and skilled they are if they can aim not 1 but 2 arrows at once. But as with all the rest of the tropes here, there are a couple of problems with doing this. The first is a matter of physics. No matter how strong I am, I can't change how much energy my bow has at full draw. So if I knock 2 arrows at once, I'm shooting twice the mass, and each one is going to have less energy on impact. Meaning that a twin shot will have less penetration than a single arrow. And while that difference might not seem important against an unarmoured target, if you're fighting foes in armour, it's going to be fairly significant. The second problem is a matter of aiming. Because in fiction, when someone makes a multi-shot, they seem to be able to aim either arrow separately at different targets. But in real life, you generally have 2 options. One is to shoot all of your arrows at the same point, in which case you're only hitting 1 target. And the second is to have arrows on either side of your riser, and so you're effectively aiming at 2 horizontal points, with the potential option of stacking more arrows to get some vertical lines. And while this doesn't completely negate any practical aspect, it does limit your options if you're in a battlefield tracking multiple moving opponents. Because if I want to move my aim to the left to target one opponent, both of the arrows are going to go to the left. Likewise, if somebody moves further back and I need to move my aim up, both of my arrows are going to go up. So it works best for shooting into densely packed groups or against static targets. And the third problem is one of time. Generally speaking, if you're an experienced archer that's likely to see combat, then you're probably able to draw, knock and shoot reasonably quickly. But the mechanisms that you'll have developed for getting the arrow ready to shoot won't necessarily apply in the same way if you're trying to do the same thing with multiple arrows. Getting them both lined up and then getting your hand into position takes time. So unless you specifically practice knocking a multi-shot on a regular basis, you'll probably find that getting another set of arrows onto the string and ready to go takes longer overall than shooting arrows 1 at a time. So given that a multi-shot is less powerful, less accurate, and also potentially slower than shooting arrows 1 at a time, it's hardly surprising that it wasn't a widespread battlefield tactic. But some of this stuff depends on the type of bow you're using. This bow is a relatively low draw weight. If I were to take a heavier bow, then the time it takes to get to full draw will be longer. And the trade-off of that extra faff knocking my arrows is going to be more and more worth it by the time I make the shot. And if I'm shooting at a massed block of enemies and I'm not too worried about individual aiming, there might be times when it would be viable. But that's not what I'm talking about here. Because despite all the trade-offs involved in this shot, it does work. And if your targets are the right distance from you and the right distance apart, you can hit both of them. And as long as your bow had a decent amount of power to start with, then those hits are going to be fairly significant. All of which puts this shot into a similar category as throwing a knife or an axe. In an open fight, it's probably not the most effective use of your weapon. But there will be times when you've got the drop on somebody, or when things line up just right, when it is worth that last Hail Mary to do something cool. All of which brings us around to number 1, curving arrows. Curving arrows are the ultimate fantasy archer trope, as far as I'm concerned. It takes something from the mundane of shooting an arrow with precision and accuracy to hit a target bang on, and takes it into the fantasy of weaving around obstacles to chase moving targets and hit them every single time. When it's applied in extremes, then you get something exactly like that, like Yondu's arrow from Guardians of the Galaxy, something which homes in on targets and flies seemingly under its own accord. It's magical, it's silly, it's fun, and I absolutely love any setting where the ranger or the archer character has some kind of magical technique that lets them do this with an arrow. But against all common sense and all logic, you can do this trick in the real world. It relies heavily on a physical principle called the archer's paradox. Essentially, the archer's paradox is that if you point an arrow straight at a target and then you release the string, the arrow will no longer be pointing straight at that target by the time the string reaches the front, because the angle between string and bow changes depending on how drawn the string is. Which means that logically, an arrow should simply skip off to the side every single time you shoot. But that doesn't happen. And the reason it doesn't happen is the construction of an arrow is heavy at the front, bendy in the middle, and has stabilizing fletchings at the back. So what actually happens when you shoot is that the inertia of the point causes a slight stacking effect as the arrow bends when pushed from the back, and it then wobbles around the bow, turns in the air, gradually becomes a rotation, and flies in a straight line. And that is absolutely fantastic. The spinning stabilizes the arrow, the bending allows them to curve around a bow that doesn't have a riser cut out, which is almost all historical bows, and the end result is the basis of basically all archery. But it's also a thing you can mess about with, because that's what happens if you knock your arrow as close to straight as you can. If you slap a slightly steeper angle on it, then when you shoot, you'll get quite a lot more wobble. So if we want to make that wobble more pronounced, we can make our arrow less stable. Putting the fletchings closer to the balance point of the arrow means that when it wobbles, it wobbles more dramatically. And that means you can shoot around an obstacle to hit an object on the far side. The downside is a fairly significant loss of power over a direct hit. And of course the fact that in order to make it work, you need to carry around a bunch of arrows that are specifically designed to be less good than your normal ones. But the last bit at least can be solved. If you can get the angle to be great enough, then even a normal arrow will curve around a target. It's not exactly going to win any drama awards, but it might be enough to put the frighteners up somebody who's hiding behind a door. And if your bow has a longer riser, you can get an even steeper angle for a more visible effect. In almost all circumstances, this is going to be a trick shot rather than a battlefield tactic. The reduction in speed and power of the arrow is too great for it to really be viable as a shot. But it was known historically. People did do this as a trick shot. And the fact that you can do it with a powerful bow and a sharp arrow really opens up the opportunities for putting the frighteners up people, or getting a toxin into someone, or just generally causing someone to have a bad day when they thought they were safe. But regardless of its battlefield implications, the fact is you can curve an arrow round an object. And if that's not real-life fantasy archery, I don't know what is. So there you have it. 5 ridiculous fantasy tropes which genuinely work. From musical bows and multi-shots, through curving arrows and commando rolls, to straight up shivving something with a bow. And if you'd like to learn how to do some of these tricks, or how to get started in archery, check out the College of Arrows, which is listed down below. It's a new learning community that I've recently set up. If you want to get fitter and learn how to run, then go onto ZRX and start getting chased by zombies. And of course, if you want to see more of these videos and more of my stuff, like, subscribe, comment, all the usual stuff, and I'll see you around.